Welcome to The Magic of the Old Mill, presented by Clarke and Ariel Morabito of the Bryant Library Local History Collection. The Bryant Library, named for 19th century poet and newspaper editor William Cullen Bryant, is the oldest continuing public library in Nassau County, New York. William Cullen Bryant resided with his family at his country home Cedarmere between 1843 and 1878. Several years before his death, he built a reading room and lecture hall for the residents of Roslyn. Several months after his death in June 1878, the Bryant Circulating Library was established, and the building was named the Bryant Library. The Old Mill in the title of the program refers to the Roslyn Gristmill, a centuries-old structure that continues to stand on Old Northern Boulevard, the main thoroughfare through the heart of Roslyn Village. The Roslyn Gristmill was constructed in the 1700s and is recognized as one of the last Dutch-type watermills in the United States. The mill has had several lives. From the 1700s through 1916, it operated as a grist mill. From 1920 through the 1970s, it was a teahouse and historical museum. When the teahouse closed its doors, the historical property was donated to Nessie. Although it sat idle for many years, it is currently being restored thanks to the efforts of the Roslyn Landmark Society. You can find details about the work that has been done and that is planned for the future of the gristmill on the Roslyn Landmark Society's website, www.roslynlandmarks.org. In this presentation, you will hear excerpts from the Bryant Library Local History Collection's Everyday Voices Oral History Collection. The voices you will hear belong to individuals who lived in Roslyn during the first half of the 20th century and knew the mill building well during the 50 years it operated as the Roslyn Mill Tea House. They share little-known details about the mill. We hope these first-hand accounts will evoke for you the magic of the old mill. Let's set the stage with a bit of Roslyn history. A bustling village today, Roslyn Village has had its economic ups and downs through the centuries. It has always been a small village in a valley, bounded on the north by Hempstead Harbor and surrounded by the Wheatley Hills. Originally known as Hempstead Harbor, the name was changed after residents complained to the postmaster that mail was being misdirected to all the other locations on Long Island with Hempstead in its name. With its access to multiple bodies of water, Roslyn developed early on as a commercial and industrial center of Long Island's North Shore. Vessels transported wood and farm produce to New York City and returned with manure that was sold to local farmers. Clams and oysters were harvested from the harbor. Roslyn was an industrial and commercial hub with 2 lumber yards, one on either side of the Hempstead Harbor Creek, and a variety of other mills and factories. There was a paper mill, a silk mill, which is shown in this image, and a sawmill. There was a lampblack factory which created soot that was used to make ink, and a glass factory that made chimneys for kerosene lamps. There were also several canneries, a pickle factory, and a factory that made barrel hoops. Commercial life centered on the mill dam, what is now Old Northern Boulevard. On the north side was the Roslyn Gristmill, which operated for over 200 years between the early 1700s and 1916, grinding the wheat, rye, barley, oats, and other grains grown by local farmers. 3 ponds filled with water flowing down the hillsides provided the water to power the paper mill and grist mill. There were carriage makers and blacksmith shops, pharmacies, meat markets, grocers, and dry goods stores. There were hotels of various sizes for travelers passing through Roslyn or visiting to relax and enjoy local scenery and attractions. Examples are the Bell Hotel, the Roslyn Hotel, and the Mansion House Hotel. However, the land around what is now Roslyn Pond and Silver Lake was a mosquito-infested swamp and dumping ground. residents took daily doses of quinine to combat malaria. Reminiscences in our collection indicate that some people moved out of the village to higher ground in the Highlands area that developed as Roslyn Heights. The poet and newspaper editor William Cullen Bryant bought land along Hempstead Harbor in 1843, which he developed into his summer retreat, which he named Cedarmere. In 1874, he built a reading room and lecture hall for the people of Roslyn, for as he wrote to a friend, the people have no places to meet in the evening, save the bar rooms. This building became the first Bryant Library after his death in 1878. It was located in the path of the viaduct over the harbor that opened in 1950 and was demolished in 1946. Bryant was one of the first New Yorkers to make Roslyn their home for at least part of the year. By the turn of the 20th century, the North Shore of Long Island was becoming known as the Gold Coast. Individuals with great wealth purchased large swaths of land in the Wheatley Hills and constructed mansions and great estates. They purchased farmland and developed polo fields and golf courses. In 1899, Clarence and Catherine Mackey began building what ultimately became a 600-acre estate called Harbor Hill. Overlooking Roslyn Village, it was located on the second highest point on Long Island and afforded views of Manhattan. Other less wealthy but still affluent families from Manhattan and Brooklyn built smaller estates or purchased country homes in Roslyn in the early 20th century. Although they split their time between the city and Roslyn, many became actively involved in the civic life of the community. They joined longtime residents such as the Godwins, descendants of William Cullen Bryant, in efforts to improve the community. They established the Roslyn Neighborhood Association and worked to beautify Roslyn and improve the quality of life of its residents. A major project was cleaning and filling in the swampy land around the ponds and creating Roslyn Park, now Roslyn's Gerry Park. William Cullen Bryant's grandson, Harold Godwin, who is seated at the far right in this photograph, financed the construction of the replica of the original paper mill that is currently in the park. He also was named as one of the original trustees of the old gristmill in 1916, when Isaac Hicks stopped operating the mill and donated it to Roslyn for use as a museum of colonial crafts. Now that we've set the scene, we'll move on to sharing a series of interview clips that we have selected from the Bryant Library's oral history collection. These excerpts are from the Everyday Voices collection, a set of oral history interviews that were conducted between the late 1960s and the late 1970s by two former Bryant Library librarians, Helen Glannon and Marian Altman. The voices you will hear belong to people who walked the streets of Roslyn 100 years ago, a time when Roslyn, as you just learned, was a very industrial town. They were affectionately known as Roslyn old-timers. Most were lifelong Roslyn residents or had lived in the community for much of their adult lives. The earliest interviews were recorded on magnetic tape, the earliest in a reel-to-reel format and later ones on micro-cassette tapes. While partial transcriptions were made of some of the interviews, the tapes were generally put away in boxes and stored in the library's local history room. They were not rediscovered until about 7 years ago, when a patron came in looking for an interview they had been told their grandmother had done. At that point, the tapes had languished, forgotten in one of our cabinets for almost 50 years. Although we had access to a cassette player, we were hesitant to play the tapes. As archivists, we know that magnetic tape has a limited life expectancy of 10 to 30 years. Even sitting dormant and unplayed, the tapes were deteriorating, and there was the danger of breakage if the tapes were played. Clearly, something needed to be done, or we would lose these voices forever. Shortly thereafter, we learned about a nationwide library grant program called Recordings at Risk that would provide funding to create digital copies of the tapes. The library applied, and in 2018, we received a grant to digitize the original recorded content for long-term preservation and access. It is a highly competitive program, with most grants going to large historical societies and academic libraries. We are proud to say that the Bryant Library was the first public library to receive funding. Thanks to this grant, we were able to send the tapes to the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts, for reformatting. We now have digital files of the recorded interviews that we are eager to share with you.
As our focus for this program is on the interviews which discuss the Roslyn Gristmill, we're going to share excerpts from interviews with 3 individuals. Alice Titus, who was born in Glen Cove in 1887 and came to Roslyn in 1919 to open the Roslyn Mill Tea House in the Old Mill. After her retirement, Alice became the first curator of the Bryant Library's local history collection, originally known as the Roslyn Gristmill Historical Collection. Here she is standing outside the tea house sometime in the 1960s. We'll also hear from Ida Hicks Seaman, who was a close friend of Alice's and lived much of her adult life in Roslyn. Her uncle, Isaac Hicks, gave the gristmill to the town in 1916, while her father, John S. Hicks, owned the lumber yard that Lumber Road in Roslyn is named for. On the topic of rebuilding the gristmill's water wheel, we'll hear from Peter Elmer Lynch, who was a lifelong Roslyn resident who joined the Roslyn Fire Department in 1921 and eventually became the Nassau County Fire Marshal. He was instrumental in rebuilding the wheel, which took place in the 1930s. His mother, Mary Pearsall Lynch, was the Bryant Library's first librarian when it was located in Bryant Hall. You'll also hear the voices of librarians Helen Glannon and Marion Altman, who conducted the interviews. We must warn you that the quality of the interviews varies, so some of the voices may be garbled or you may hear background noises. We hope, though, that you will feel some of the magic of the old gristmill as you listen to the memories of Alice, Ida, and Peter. One of the most detailed interviews in the Everyday Voices oral history collection was given by Alice Titus, who ran the tea house from 1920 to 1951. Titus was from New Hampshire, but her uncle, John Tappan, was a Roslyn resident who often golfed with Harold Godwin, who we learned before was William Cullen Bryant's grandson. In 1916, Isaac Hicks ceased operation of the mill. He transferred ownership to a board of 5 trustees in order for the mill to, quote, be restored to its original form in order that it might house a museum of industrial arts. According to a booklet published in the 1930s entitled The Story of the Roslyn Gristmill, it was agreed between Isaac Hicks and Harold Godwin that if Hicks gave the property to the village, Godwin would give the funds to make restorations to the mill. The beams were reinforced and concrete siding made to look like wood was installed. The water wheel and grinding stones were left intact. They began to accept donations for a historical museum, but they needed some kind of income to help pay for further repairs and expenses. The idea was put forth that it could be turned into a tea house. They then needed to find someone to run it, and since she had prior experience running a tea house in New Hampshire, Tappan suggested his niece, Alice. Here is Alice's first impression of walking into the tea house.
When Mr. Godwin turned the 7-inch long brass key in the massive door of the mill, and I beheld the great beams and the blue water of the creek through the rear windows, I knew this was it.
Miss Titus, when you walked into the mill, did it look nice today?
It looked very much the same as it does today, with the exception of the tea tables and chairs and the necessary tea room equipment. Much of the museum was rearranged and put back more nearer the walls in order to make room for the tea room. But still, they were very much in evidence, and everyone that came in, besides enjoying tea or lunch or dinner, stayed to admire and talk about the exhibits in the museum.
Also being interviewed with Alice was Ida Hicks Seaman, who was the daughter of John S. Hicks, proprietor of Roslyn's Hicks Lumberyard. We'll now hear Ida further discuss the tea house's inception, as well as physical restorations of the mill.
You mentioned that it had been restored by William Cullen Bryant's grandson, Howard Godwin. How did it happen that a mill which had been grinding grain since 1701 became a tea room?
Well, by the time that Alice took over the mill, by that time, the business had begun to dwindle because of the development of mills in the West and in New England, which ground flax and barley and rye and corn and so forth. And the mill was only grinding chicken feed, so because there wasn't grain enough for it to go on as a mill. And most of the grain had been brought in by schooner from New England and from neighboring farms.
Weren't there many other mills that this happened to? Why did the people feel that this mill should be restored?
Because it was one of the oldest mills on Long Island, and certainly one of the first buildings in Roslyn. The people felt that, it was a wonderful landmark and should be restored, Mr. Godwin especially.
Mrs. Seaman, when you say restore the mill, what do you mean?
Well, put in good physical condition. The beams were weakened, everything had to be strengthened, a new roof put on, and some additions that were put on the original mill had to be taken off, and dormer windows put in for the kitchen and the tea room. That's about all I can think of.
Didn't this cost a lot of money?
Yes, Mr. Godwin very generously gave money to restore it.
So as you can see, the restoration of the mill has always been important to the people of Roslyn. One of the things most often mentioned when it comes to the gristmill is the mill wheel. In this next clip, Alice Titus describes the wheel's provision of hydraulic power, which was the tea room's entire power source.
What about lights?
In the very early days of the mill, I think for the first 2 years, we had nothing but candlelight upstairs and in the tea room and in the kitchen and in the pantry. But a little later, Mr. Godwin had the very bright idea of having me make my electric lights with the water power from the mill wheel. We didn't have any storage battery, so we were not able to store up anything at all for an emergency. But when it began to get dark and I wanted some lights, I would run out along the flume and lift up the water gates, and that would let in enough water to turn the big wheel, and that in its turn would start the flywheel, which worked the generator, and on would come the electric lights all over the building. And then, if I were very busy, and the tide was going out, the water from the mill ponds through the water gates would come faster and faster, and the wheel would go faster and faster, till finally every bulb in the building would burn out all at once. On the other hand, if I would be very busy in the kitchen, and I was quite busy being hostess, electrician, and cook all at the same time, the lights would get dimmer and dimmer, and that would mean that the tide was going out, and the tide was coming in at this point, and the wheel would go slower and slower, and it meant many trips every few minutes to go out and lift up the water gate, let in more power, and bring on the lights so that we could see what we were doing.
Now we're going to hear from Peter Lynch. Peter was born in Roslyn in 1901. As a young man, he worked as a carpenter and general contractor. In his interview, Peter gives a strong sense of Roslyn's industrial atmosphere during the early 20th century. Here he discusses projects that were completed during the Depression, including the outside deck.
During the Depression years, they built the porch on the back, the outside porch. They rebuilt the sluiceway, which brought the water from Silver Lake onto the road, and over where the water wheel was. They decided that they wanted to pit where the wheel had been and the runway down to the harbor. And the WPA fellows wouldn't do it. It was too dirty. And so a man by the name of Kraft, Charles O. Kraft, who was also a carpenter, he got the job to rebuild the wheel. We took this job, and it was dirty, and it was cold weather at that time. It was winter time. You had to work in boots. You were usually up to your knees in water and muck. We dug this thing out by hand, all the way from the bulkhead at the end of the creek up to the mill, and then the wheel pit. I don't wonder the WPA fellas didn't want to do it. But anyway, we got $5 a day, and again, this was what we called eating money. When we got to digging out the pit, at the bottom of the pit, we found the ironwork from the original mill wheel axle, and it was in just as good shape as the day it was made. Now, whether this goes back to, there was a date carved in one of the beams in that mill, 16-something. Whether it goes back that far, of course, it's impossible to tell. But this
You say there was a beam carved at
There's a beam carved down there that has this, with this date carved in it.
1600?
In the 1600s.
Where is that beam?
Well, it may be covered up. They're tremendous big timbers. It's underneath the teahouse floor. There's a basement. And downstairs, there's a door that you can go in. And you look up, and this is the supporting timbers for the mill floor. And because it was a mill with tremendous weights, they're tremendous beams, and then carved in there. I've forgotten the exact date. My memory slipped on that.
Lastly, Peter tells a somewhat amusing story about an incident that occurred when he was on the job.
It was a funny thing. I fell overboard, and it was midwinter. We were working on the wheel. We had the three rims tied together with a piece of wood across, and it was tacked into each one. I walked out to look at something on the inside rim on this scaffold over the water, and I was carrying a 3-foot Stilson wrench in one hand, and I had my hammer in the other, and my overalls pockets were full of these big brass bolts that weighed a ton. And I reached over to lean on this board that went across, and one of my friends who was supposed to have tacked it hadn't tacked it, and away it went, and down I went into the wheel pit. And I can remember going down, my back hit the bottom of that pit because I weighed a ton with all that iron on me. I came up out of there, and we had a little room in the bottom of the mill partitioned off, and we had an oil stove in there. Went in there, and I had to take off all my clothes. Each one of them gave me something to put on, enough so that I could get home and get dry clothes.
Even though he talks about this in a comedic way, it's clear that the work that they were doing with the wheel was very dangerous. Now we'll return to Alice Titus. As she says in her interview, she was very dedicated to her tea house, even with some of the issues she faced in starting it up and running it.
Now to go back to the mill as a tea room, Miss Titus, will you tell us just how you went about this venture?
As soon as I knew the old mill was to be my tea house, I started right in painting tables and chairs and collecting china, silverware, and all the paraphernalia that necessary to cook with and to serve the public. Every morning I arrived early and worked all day until quite late, and for the first 3 weeks Mr. and Mrs. Godwin very kindly invited me to be their guests. The next morning, on my arrival at the mill, I started in cooking for my first paying guests. The day before had been a great success, and to my amazement, I had 16 people for tea the very first afternoon. I was simply thrilled and thought, wouldn't it be perfectly wonderful if someday, years hence, I might have as many as 65. All went well in spite of the intense cold. We only had a little Franklin stove, which smoked like everything, and as soon as the tea room would get the slightest bit warm, we'd have to open the doors to let the smoke out, and that would let the cold air in again so that it was not of very much use. And on Thanksgiving Day, it was so very cold, we had to close the tea room for the winter. When I opened the mill again, in the 1st of April in 1920, it was still extremely cold because it was only the 1st of April. I built as large fires in the little Franklin stove as was possible, but still the smoke billowed out, and it wasn't until later in the year that we discovered that there was no flue whatsoever in the little Franklin stove, and it was only there as an exhibit and meant to be admired. Every morning I would wear my galoshes and a sweater, and I'd keep that on no matter how fast I worked and ran around the mill to keep warm. But at 12 o'clock, when it was time to open the doors for the public, I would take off the galoshes and the sweater and try to pretend it was warm enough for anybody to come in and enjoy themselves.
What did you use for cooking?
And I look back now on the early days of the mill, when I had nothing but a little kerosene oil stove. I wonder how I ever cooked the dinner party, but that was my only equipment. Cooking on a kerosene stove is not always cracked up to be. The stove only had 3 burners and a little tin oven, and very often, right in the middle of trying to bake a cake, the oil in the well would run out completely, and the well would have to be refilled no matter what else I might be doing.
So you can see it was not easy setting up a restaurant in an old ancient mill. Still, Alice became well regarded as the tea house hostess, especially for her popovers.
Miss Titus, you were famous for the popovers you made.
I never knew why the popovers popped so beautifully. It just was the magic of the old mill. They popped with a kerosene stove, and later, when it became necessary to make as many as 100 or 108 for the people who came to tea, they still popped just exactly as well for the gas that had been installed.
This next clip describes a somewhat comical anecdote involving 2 non-human residents of the mill. At this point in time, Alice, along with the cook, Mabel Lutz, were actually living inside the building.
As the tea room business grew, I was most fortunate in getting excellent people, all from living around Roslyn. I particularly remember Mrs. Mabel Lutz, who came to me as cook. She and I, feeling rather reluctant to go to our homes after we'd been putting in a long day in the mill, decided we'd like to sleep upstairs. So 2 little rooms were fixed up and a bath, and for several summers we stayed right there in the mill, and they were about the most happy and healthful of my life.
What about the rat?
The only trouble was, again, the rats. One night when I was sound asleep, and my little kitten was curled up asleep at the foot of my bed, I suddenly felt a terrible commotion going on all over me. When I looked out from under the bedclothes, I saw the rat and the cat in mortal combat. I screamed, and Mrs. Lutz tried to answer me and tried to come to me, but she couldn't find her candle, and she couldn't find my room. She got there just in time to see the rat and the cat fall off the bed, and the rat pull its way to the rat hole, and with the cat still clinging to its tail. But the rat won out, and later in the day we had to fill up that rat hole.
Once it was established, the tea house was host to not only residents, but tourists and some very famous Hollywood names at that time.
I'm sure you served many famous people, too. Tell us a little about them.
We had many famous people right from the beginning. Jane Cowell was a frequent visitor for lunch on the porch, and Norma Shearer of the early movie days, and Raymond Massey, who was currently playing Abe Lincoln in New York. Our most beloved famous guest, perhaps, was Leslie Howard. He came every Sunday for all summer. He would come from New York with a friend to ride horseback, stabling his horses in Westbury. He did not wish to be recognized, and so we always gave him a table that he preferred way in the darkest corner of the mill. And when, during World War I, he was shot down over the North Sea and was lost, his loss was very deeply felt at the old mill.
Can you tell us more about Christopher Morley?
Christopher Morley and his wife, Titania, were frequent visitors at the mill. Mrs. Morley particularly for the gift shop, but Mr. Morley would see that anything that she admired, be it a handmade hutch table or a little cup and saucer, he would have it delivered to her house the next day. The Exchange Club in Roslyn, who at that time used to have their luncheons and meet in the old mill. Christopher Morley was one of the honorary members of that club and would come down and make very amusing speeches. At one of the speeches, he proclaimed that Alice Titus should be made an honorary member of the Exchange Club. There was much hand-clapping, but that was the end of it. I never heard anything more about it.
The next clip we'll hear mostly features Ida Seaman, where she talks about the gristmill when it was at street level.
Miss Titus, we've been told that at one time the mill was level with the street. Is that true?
Yes, it was. But when the road was widened and the macadamized and all, the road was built up so that it was above the level of the mill, and the little steps that came down to the mill led into the tea room. And many people that came in wanted to know why the little steps. Of course, this was done before I came to Roslyn, and so I think Mrs. Seaman can tell more about that.
Well, when I first remember the road, it was level with the mill door. And I think that the level was changed several times before it got as high as it is now. At one time, the road was so narrow, and it was really made of planks. And this was before I can remember, but I was told that a circus was moving from New York to the eastern end of the island. Of course, they had to go by foot. And when the elephants reached the mill dam, they very gingerly put the foot out and felt the structure and refused to go over. They knew it wouldn't hold them. They had to go around the ponds.
Even though it's not a first-hand memory, that detail about the elephants being too smart to step on unstable ground is one of our favorite little moments in the oral history interviews. After her retirement, Alice Titus became the first curator of the Bryant Library's local history collection, where Carol and I work. Here she is in the Bryant Room under a sign that reflects the collection's original name, the Rosalind Gristmill Historical Collection. You can still see this sign in the Bryant Room if you come to visit us.